Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 208 of Retro Power Uncut. And I was remembering that by a particular Peugeot of uncertain parentage, shall we say. Anyway, enough of that. We have a little comedy joke about the episode number each time, and that was where that came from. But yeah, we're going to start with Project Portofino, the XJ Coupe. And it has an engine in it. I know that's not rocket science. I know that Tom Lenthal has also put one of these together, and very nice it is too. And one of the points of conversation actually earlier this week was, I haven't actually watched the video, but Cal was telling me he had watched Tom Lenthal's video regarding the dynoing of an XJR6 engine that he built. And the dyno results, which I can't remember the exact number, but I think he was talking about something of the order of 640 newton meters of torque, which is a pretty torquey engine. You're in the same sort of realms. To put things in perspective here, you're talking about the same sort of torque output as a stock Chevy LS3 at that, a 6.2 litre LS3, which is pretty handy amount of torque, that is. That is going to propel an XJ Coupe pretty rapidly down the road. Obviously, we have previously put a standard LS3 in an XJ Coupe and can testify that that is not a slow car by any stretch of the imagination. So certainly going with the XJR6 engine, as will be discussed further on through this project, is not a simple solution, and they're not a very easy engine to rebuild for reasons we've touched on before, but it will certainly push the car down the road at a very respectable rate, and it does keep it all Jaguar. But anyway, back to the plot, back to the relevant things. The engine, the mock-up engine, obviously this is just dry build mock-up. This is an engine that was sourced from Simply Performance. Ben at Simply Performance has sorted a lot of parts out for us. He sorted the engine out for us, and it actually came from a manual transmission XJR6 donor. So it actually has the gearbox that it left Jaguar with bolted back onto it now, which is kind of irrelevant but nice. So Matt and Stu got that fitted earlier in the week, and as we suspected it should be, it is just a Jaguar parts bin exercise apart from the gearbox crossmember, which Stu has just finished making cardboard mock-up of, and Luke is currently turning that into a sheet metal CAD model infusion so that we can plasma cut the parts out for that and Stu can fabricate it. So that's all going well, but all the other parts were just bolt-in parts using the original XJ Coupe front crossmember, which is in very good condition actually, probably partly due to oil leakage over it from the Jaguar engine, and partly due to the fact the car was fairly low mileage and had been fairly well looked after, so there wasn't too much inherent corrosion in that. So Matt's got that jet washed off, cleaned off, got it all looking pretty decent, and stuck that back in. And then attached to that, the later XJS used the same series crossmember as a Series 2 or 3 XJ6, but it then used the 4 litre AJ16 engine. So it's possible to use stock Jaguar XJS engine mount brackets for the engine block and for the crossmember. Slight hiccup in proceedings there was that we forgot about the block brackets, and we didn't actually have any with this engine. We initially tried to fit the engine with the X300 engine block brackets, but the XJS crossmember brackets, and obviously that didn't line up, and then it suddenly dawned on us that we needed the XJS engine mount brackets as well, the engine half of those. Fortunately we had a set of those because we used those in the Churchill project, so we've pinched those from the Churchill project for the dry build on this, because for a long-winded explanation, but we actually want to get some new ones for that, some replacement ones for that. There was a little bit of corrosion on them, and the Xylan coating had been compromised by the pitting corrosion that was in those brackets, so we actually want to get those zinc metal sprayed and powder coated instead. So that's actually not really too much of a problem. We're getting another set of those brackets. We're going to powder coat with zinc metal spray and powder coat those will go into Churchill, and then the ones that we've used for dry build on this, we'll shot blast the Xylan off them, then they'll be zinc metal sprayed and powder coated for this build. So anyway, all an aside, all very relevant to this job. So now the engine is sat on its XJS brackets, XJS mounts, XJS crossmember mounts on Series 3 original XJC front cross member, all bolted straight in, all fits nicely, all as if it was meant for the job. We've got the cast iron X300 XJR6 manifolds on this at the moment, exhaust manifolds, but we're going to change those. We're going to go for a fabricated tubular manifold, which we'll either make in-house or we'll get Simpson to do. We'll probably get Simpson Exhaust to do that, get Matt Simpson to make us those. He does a beautiful job. I would imagine that's the way we're going to go on that, though we've not finalised that decision yet. The problem with I'm just going to put my drink down here for a moment. I know I get lots of criticism for carrying that, but that's my crutch, it's my prop. I like to have something in my hand that I don't know what to do with my hands. That's why, and I need a coffee. I haven't had anything to drink yet today, so I need a coffee. It's 12:30 and I've not actually yet had a drink, so that's the other reason I've got it, because I'm getting a bit dried out. Anyway, manifolds, yes. XJR6 manifolds crack. They all crack, they've all done it. Every X300 I've ever looked at with a supercharged XJR6 in it has got cracked manifolds. You can hear them ticking away until they get warmed up. And this is no different. This has got two thundering great cracks through the manifolds. So we're not going to use those manifolds because they're cracked. I doubt I'll be able to find any that aren't cracked, and if I do, the engine will crack them anyway. So we won't do that. We will fit some nice tubular stainless steel ones, and we won't have catalysts in them on this car, so that won't be a problem. They won't build up so much heat and it won't damage them. The reason they crack, I think, is due to the catalysts on the downpipe. They build a lot of heat in the manifolds, and I think that's why they crack. Don't get me wrong, cast iron in itself is an extremely good material for exhaust manifolds, but the abuse they get on these supercharged engines with catalysts in the downpipes is great, and it does damage them. So we'll go tubular. So that's all that lot. I think we have a plan to change the steering rack on this to the XJS ZF higher ratio steering rack, but again, I need to finalise that with Cal and the customer, whether he would like slightly faster steering. I don't see why he wouldn't. It certainly complements the drivability of the car, because the steering was quite ponderous on these as standard. So, and the steering rack is a much nicer piece of engineering. The power rack type racks that are on these, which are, I've forgotten the Adwest racks that are on these cars are nowhere near as nice as the ZF racks that were fitted to the facelift XJS. So I would say, without actually having had that conversation, that it would be much better if we go for the ZF rack. I imagine that'll be an upgrade that will happen, but at the moment it's got the Adwest power rack on it, which is fine, works, but they're just not as nice as the ZF one, so I think that'll be an upgrade. But yeah, in terms of outer body metal work, that is pretty much done. As you can see, that's all been sanded off, cleaned up. We've put a little bit of WD-40 wiped over it to prevent any surface flash corrosion happening between now and further on. If a little bit happens, it's not the end of the world. We can soon remove that again, but it's just nice not to have the car covered in surface rust when people are looking at it. So we do that. We do then have to be very, very careful, as Mark may mention in his bit in a bit, about making sure that's all removed again when we get to the body prep stage. Yeah, that's where we're at on that, on the front end of the car. On the back end, Matt and Stu have also fitted and Tom a little bit, I think Tom was helping on that as well. We've also fitted the rear axle assembly now, which, as I've mentioned before, but I'll touch on again, is a late facelift XJS rear end, which has the outboard brake. So that's, on these, it's very easy. We don't have to build the rear end from parts. A standard XJS rear end just bolts in and is the right track, and that already has the outboard brakes. It was like the culmination of the original type of Jaguar independent rear suspension before they changed to the type that was developed for the XJ40 with the revised lower arms and a different type of cradle. The early type cradle, the last iteration of that was what was fitted to the sort of 1994 era XJS, and that's a really good bolted upgrade for these. It has the type of cradle that will bolt straight into the shell on this, no modifications at all, but it uses the a modified type of lower arm with a different size hole in it basically, and it uses the XJ40 type aluminium outboard rear uprights, which use a different bearing setup, a much stronger bearing setup, a different drive shaft, and an outboard brake setup which gets much better brake cooling. People will, I'm sure, I've seen in comments before, people saying, why would you want to go to outboard brake? You're raising the unsprung weight. Yes, we are very slightly raising the unsprung weight, but we're massively improving the brake cooling. The massive disadvantage of the earlier type brake setup was that the brakes were inboard, and it was very hard to cool them. and they do get too hot and they overheat, and it is very hard to get efficient braking on the back in what is quite a heavy car. So yes, unsprung weight, great. Brake cooling, bad. Unsprung weight on this car, not that relevant. The unsprung weight versus the sprung weight, the key thing when people talk about unsprung weight, and I'm going off on a tangent here, people talk about unsprung weight on its own as a thing, as an objective on its own, reducing unsprung weight, good. Yeah, reducing unsprung weight is good, but it's the ratio of unsprung weight to sprung weight that is the absolute key to that. On a very lightweight car, if you have a big unsprung weight, it's very bad. On a very heavy car, having a fairly high unsprung weight, much less relevant, because your springing and damping really depends on the ratio of sprung to unsprung weight, not either one of those on its own. And on a big heavy car like this, having a bit more unsprung weight, not the end of the world. Having brakes that don't work, the end of the world. So that's why we do that, and that's why we like to do that upgrade. There are times when, on the balance of the two factors, we have to make a decision against that, as we did with the Interceptor. But in this case, where it's bolt-on Jaguar parts, and we can do it using Jaguar parts bin parts that Simply Performance have kindly sourced us from the USA, from a USA spec XJS that hasn't suffered from any rust, so the parts recondition really nicely and easily, makes loads of sense to use it. So that's what's happening there. So we have the rear axle in, front axle in, XJR6 engine in, Getrag 290 gearbox from the XJR6 in. Stu's just mocked up the gearbox cross member, so that's well underway. We've made decisions on that. We're using a BMW E36 engine mount as the transmission mount in that. They have the right amount of compliance, the right amount of damping, and we didn't really want to get into the whole Jaguar double spring and semi-damped arrangement. I'm sure the Jaguar arrangement did work very well in its time. The XJS arrangement is obsolete, with the rubber in it, is obsolete now and irreplaceable basically, because nobody's remoulded the part. And the X300 used a big double spring arrangement, which is what we've used on Churchill, but it doesn't really fit very nicely under this, so we're not going to use that on this. So that's why we've gone that route with that. You'll see more on that in the future once we've actually got it made. Now Stu has now moved on to the HVAC arrangement on this and getting that underway. Basically modifying the bulkhead area, not actually coming through the bulkhead we don't think, but modifying the underside of the scuttle basically to accommodate the Vintage Air HVAC unit. So that's his work for probably the next week or so. He's going to be getting that accommodated in the car. So good progress, things are moving forward nicely. This scuttle arrangement, by the way, this has just been bolted back on to hold the radiator in place, and that's only really as a placeholder. We will be changing the radiator to an aluminium one, but we need it there as a placeholder just to give us a bit of guidance on mock-up. We're getting the things in place, and this air intake just happened to be mounted to that scuttle. Rest assured we won't be using this little peeper here for getting the air into that engine. That just happens to still be attached to that. We'll be remaking all this, so we need to reformat a lot of the front to get the cold air intake for the engine. So I'll stop warbling on about this now. That's plenty enough about that. We'll move on. We're going to move on to Audi. I'm going to come around here. Tom's actually working, or what? He's just gone over there now. Tom's actually working on the Audi Saab Wasabi project. We're currently back on with shortening this. I'm not doing it because I've been doing lots of other things. So Tom's picked up this for the minute. Bit of a fill-in. Tom's actually going to be moving on again to something else we're going to talk about, and Bobby will be picking this up. But at the moment, Tom's kind of making some progress on it. Bobby's on holiday this week. He's over in Wales having a nice time on holiday, and so Tom's picking up a little bit of work on this at the moment. So two angles of attack. He's continued the floor pan changes that I'd started, so he's done the same as I'd done on the near side floor pan on the offside floor pan and got that underway, and he has then made the mounting. Basically he's building up the rear skid so that we can unconnect it from the jig and be able to slide the rear end forward. He's getting all that prepared. So he's sorted out the mounting pads for the diagonal braces, got them bolted onto the two rear beams, welded the braces onto those so they're all in situ and nothing can move. It can't parallel it. The two rear beams can't move. In fact, we're going to walk around there. It'll be easier to show you. If you come round here, Jarkle, and stand about there, I can gesticulate at this lot. There we go. We'll try and do this. How's that work? Basically, this mounting pad here and this mounting pad under here are now bolted to these two rear beams. These two beams are bolted currently to this jig bed. The bolts are actually under these pads, so one at a time we're going to have to remove these stanchions, take out the bolts and then put these back. But nothing will move. If we take them out one at a time, that won't be a problem. There's 4 of them, so changing it to 3 and then putting that back won't be a problem. So we'll take them out, remove the bolts, put them back. These two beams are now braced together by these diagonals and these base plates here. And because they're diagonal, nothing can move like that, nothing can move like that. That's all braced together as one big skid now. So when we take the bolts out, that stays resting with its own weight, which is considerable, on the bed of that jig. And then Tom's put 2 skids down the side here, a box section, which you can see here, which are tack welded to these 2 beams. So these 2 bits now are against the side of this jig bed. So this whole skid can't go side to side, it can't twist, it stays aligned to these 2 jig beams, which are dead parallel for the whole length of this jig bed. So then once those bolts are out, nothing can move other than forwards and backwards. At that point, we can finish the incisions in the sills, remove the last parts of the sill, and then the whole back of the car can slide forward. And this is very much the same way that a stretched limousine or a wheelbase altered vehicle, such as limousines generally are, that is very much how they're built. For example, take a Mercedes S-Class type limousine. To build one of those, the body sides are removed, the roof panel is removed, the floor pan is basically broken along one of the spot weld lines, I don't know which without looking at that particular car, and the floor pan will be separated without any body sides on. All the sill structure will be completely removed, leaving the inner sill structure which will be split. The car will then be stretched, a new section of floor which will be made on some fairly rudimentary press tooling, probably some soft metal press tooling or resin press tooling. The new floor sections will be pressed, added in, the sills will be stretched and the usually folded sections will be welded in there, and then new body sides, which are now on modern limousines, are then made in a big carbon fibre moulding, will then be bonded onto the sides of that floor pan, probably bonded and riveted or bonded and bolted as a bit of an anti-peel measure. They'll then be added onto the sides of that floor pan in just the same way as what we're doing here. We're going the opposite way, we're shortening. We're going to shorten this floor pan and then effectively add the new body sides, and the new body sides will be the Saab. So it's very much the same procedure as building a limousine, except we're actually making a shorter one and putting a Saab body on it. But certainly my knowledge of limousine builders, they use very much the same thing as we have here. In fact, some of them actually just use a pair of select jigs joined together, but basically a long jig bench where the entire length of the vehicle can be accommodated, and basically the rails are used to slide that vehicle longer or shorter, and then the vehicle is grafted back together. Exactly the same thing, exactly the same method. What you have to be careful of is working with the structure of the vehicle that you're working with, not against it. Tom and I have just been through where we're going to put various incisions in bits here, and what joints we're working with on the original shell, so that we maintain the strength of the original joints and we don't compromise anything there. Once all that's done, great, we have the revised structure, and we can then look at next week starting to hopefully offer the Saab upper body onto that and work out designing the intermediate panels to go between the two. I'll just show you another bit round here that Tom's been working on. As part of this is quite a good little demonstration. Jamie will have some B-roll footage of this occurring, but as an example of the sort of modifications that are needed, these were the underfloor reinforcers. You'd sort of call them a chassis rail. They're like a chassis rail extension that basically cantilevers the load from the front of the car back into the floor pan, transfers it through that torsional member on the front of the sill into the bottom of the A-pillar structure, and then into these seat mounting structures. That transfers the load into the sill structure and into the tunnel structure, and basically acts as a big cantilever with all the loading from the front of the car. And that actually carries on to this rear seat mounting cross member, which isn't actually, it's only a pressing, there's not a lot of strength to that. This big section on the Cabriolet adds a lot of additional strength to it. Basically that longitudinal member carries on and joins that seam. Now, as you can see now, there's a big gap here. We're shortening the floor pan by 137 millimeters. And what we've done is then remove the floor out of the way, got this longitudinal member, taken the 137 millimeters out of that in a section where it was parallel here. That's then been welded back together at that section to maintain the rear section, but in a further forward position. Tom's braced all that up, used straight edges, clamped to it to get that put back together, and then chased all that together so it's nicely in line, welded that back together. And then this section, when the back of the car moves forward, this bit here will end up back underneath this original seam here. Then when we remake this, we're going to remake the flange along the bottom of here, re-weld a new flange to that, and then that'll all be then spot welded back together along that line, so it'll be exactly as the factory joint back on the end of this longitudinal member, just in a new position 137mm forward. So that's, in a particular example, that's a good explanation of how that particular part of this operation will work. Similar thing will be done with this. Similar thing will be done with the inner sill joint here, where there's a lap joint in there from the factory. We're going to move that lap joint forward, extricate part of the inner sill from it, and then add the piece of inner sill back into that lap joint further forward. And then this section of inner sill here will literally be spliced and shortened, but in a different position to where the original lap joint is there, to stagger the joint in that. So it's fairly simple stuff. It's just working with the structure, not against the structure for parts of the job like that. I think that's pretty much where we're at on Wasabi. We'll just see, you'll be able to watch as that develops, but it's going to be a shorter car, hopefully, next week. Moving on from that, we're going to touch briefly on, I'm going to put that down again, briefly on the E-Type. Actually, I'm going to have a quick swing of that. Or I'm going to dry up with all this fast talking. E-Type. Hopefully, all being well, all going to plan. Andy, or Sam, I don't know, but I think Andy from Vintage Machines will be bringing back the E-Type rear clam on Monday of next week. Today is Thursday, that'll be coming back on Monday of next week. And then Tom will be moving over to working on this, I believe initially with Andy hopefully, to get that new rear clam all mounted and screwed in place on here. And to that end, as I mentioned in advance last week, Tom has removed the extraneous metalwork that was the original rear inner arches from this area and from around this area, sort of just at the back of the inner arch here, and he's trimmed back the forward half of the existing inner arches to the parallel section, or to the almost parallel section. We've got to just flatten out the very edge of that, but he's trimmed that all back to the bit that we'll be leaving in. So when we put the new clam on, it can all be supported on these outriggers, these inner sections, screwed in place to the rear scuttle, screwed in place down the B-pillars, all lined up, nicely supported on the rear of the car, and then Tom can start work on building the new inner rear arches on this, getting that done, getting all that rear clam mounted in place. So to that end, Tom's cleaned all the rust up that was over all this rear section, got all that grot cleaned off. Thoroughly unpleasant task, but cleaning off all the grot and mess. There was never actually any paint on that from the factory, so there was surface rust over all that we wanted to put some paint on that. So he's cleaned all that surface rust off, and then using the 3M type strip and clean, no, Norton in fact, strip and clean discs, cleaned all that off, and then put some epoxy primer on that, just to protect that steelwork in the future, because there are various areas where we'll probably struggle to get full paint coverage in there when we actually come to paint the car. So he's just put some protection in there to get that all prepared, so that on Monday we can start the task of fitting the rear end to this, and that's going to be pretty good progress. I'm sure you're all going to love the finished rear end on this. It's going to look pretty impressive. That's going to be quite a thing to see. George has also been working on the front of this, but I'm going to leave Cal to talk about that. It's because more of a CAD den operation that's been going on the front of this, because we're trying to push the front end on in parallel, because we know there's going to be a bit of delay, obviously a delay, there'll be a bit of a lead time in getting the tooling made to do some of the carbon fibre work that we still have to undertake for the inside of the bonnet on this car. So we need to get that underway. But yeah, it's looking really good, nice progress, all looking very satisfactory. Moving on from that, we'll come round here, and Matt and Gibbo's pretending to be Gibbo's in here pretending to be a fine David Brown engine. But we're here working on the Aston DBS, and Matt is doing a cracking job of getting on with the strip down on this. Once he had finished working on the engine mock-up on the XJC, Project Portofino, he's moved on to working on the DBS. And as you can see, work proceeds apace with getting this stripped down. The interior is all out. That's all going to be going down to the interior shop down the road at the den. That'll be going into storage down there, because that's a better place really for storing the interior parts, and that's where the new interior work will be done, so makes sense for all that to be going down there. And now the current theme is getting the glazing trim strips removed, getting the glass out, basically working from the inside outwards. Once that's out, the next step then will be engine and gearbox out. Now the engine and gearbox are going back to Aston Workshop where the car was sourced from. They're having the engine back. The price that was agreed on this car was agreed on the basis that they have the engine and gearbox back, because we have no use for that. That's a bit of a clue as to what's going on, that we're not using the original engine and gearbox, but we're not. So they're going back. I'm not going to tell you what we are using, that's a surprise for the future, but the original engine and gearbox are going back up to Aston Workshop. That was part of the agreement with them, to the agreement on the price of this. So yeah, that's coming out. That'll be the next job to come out after the glass is all out. But yeah, progress is moving on nicely. Once Matt's got everything off the body on this, so it's just the body shell left. Obviously it's a tale of two battles on the body shell on this, in that these, for those who are unfamiliar, these are an aluminium outer panel over a very familiar construction with Aston Martins. They're an aluminium panelling over a steel inner structure. So they have you'd say it's a chassis, but it's not really a chassis, it's like a semi-monocoque. They use similar to the Jensen CV8 and sort of kind of a development of the Superleggera sort of type of build structure that you would find on an Aston DB4 or DB5. On these they use a more extended pressed type inner steel structure, but with aluminium outer panels clinched over that. So Matt's next job, once this is all stripped down to a shell, will be to get all the paint stripped off, which will be a hot air gun and scraper job largely, just scraping all the paint back to the aluminium, and then at that point getting the aluminium body off. And as an example, this line here is where the front wing and scuttle, which are welded together, have a join back to the original part of the body shell, and the front wings are then clinched around the A-pillar. That'll be removed down there, and the whole front end, the wings, the front scuttle and the scuttle at the bottom of the screen, sorry, the front slant panel and the scuttle all come off as one piece. Now, whether we keep that as one piece or whether we split them, they were originally welded, I think, somewhere on this corner there's a weld line as well. Whether we split that on the weld lines early on or try and take it off in one and split it later, it will need to be split. There's going to be quite a lot of repair work on this. We're not really carrying a lot of body modification on this, and I think we will probably try and reuse the bulk of the aluminium panel work, because most of it's pretty good. I think most of it's reusable. There's going to be quite a lot of this sort of corrosion around the apertures, and undoubtedly we're going to need to make some new sections around the apertures. I imagine the aluminium's beyond saving in a lot of areas, so we'll be making new edges, but they can be TIG welded in. And working with aluminium, it's quite easy to planish those welds in. It's very easy to weld those repair sections in. So I think we'll be doing quite a lot of aluminium repair work, and then quite a lot of reuse of the aluminium panelling. The theme with this car is going to be very much a reasonably sympathetic Restomod in terms of our type of Restomods. This one's going to be reasonably sympathetic in terms, certainly in terms of the body, if not maybe in terms of the engine and transmission. It's certainly going to be reasonably sympathetic in terms of the body, because they are a nice looking car. There's a couple of clangers in the design which I've seen a few people pick up on in the comments, mainly the rear valance, which looks fairly horrendous on a standard car. That obviously will be going, but a lot of the original design will be staying. And at that point, it does make sense to use a lot of the original aluminium work where we can and where it can be preserved. So we probably, I imagine, we'll see when it's all stripped, cleaned up, got back, how much of it we can reuse. If we don't reuse it, what will be going in its place will be shaped pretty much as per the original panel work. So obviously, there's a really great hole in the roof, so we're going to need a roof for it. Whether we use a used Aston roof and graft that in, or whether we just wheel up a new roof panel, I imagine we'll just wheel up a new aluminium roof and graft that in, scribe that out, cut it in, TIG weld it in, planish it up. Probably be quicker to do that than to put a used Aston roof on it. Might just make more sense to wheel up a new roof section. Again, we'll see when we get to that. We'll probably speak to Aston Workshop in case they've got a roof lying around that's in really good condition. If they haven't, we'll just wheel one up. But yeah, we're looking forward to getting this all stripped back so we can see this car's got a lot of history. It's had a lot going on. It's got some crash damage, not significant, but it's got some crash damage in it. We can see some damage in the floors. The floors are pretty crumpled. Below the passenger seat, it's been hit from underneath pretty heavily by something, or jacked up by somebody that couldn't see, I think. So the floor's been completely crushed and pushed back down. So we're going to be replacing that. There'll be quite a lot of work in terms of the floors, quite a lot of repair work. There's some very interesting bits of construction in these. I'd be interested in knowing from somebody that's worked on one of these before, but the inner rear wheel arches, to get the curvature into the inner rear wheel arches, it appears that, and it looks factory to me, it appears that the arch shape has been achieved by splitting the metal to get the shrinkage. I can point at it, you can see it on that side, you can see it here, there's splits. Now I initially thought that was a repair, but looking at it, I think that's how they were actually made. So whether they didn't have an echo machine for shrinking that in production, I don't know, because obviously they weren't a pressing. But I'm amazed that that was how it was done. But it does appear to be factory, that's been split, shrunk in, and then welded back together. So yeah, interesting. Odd feature of construction for a semi-volume production car. Equally, if there's not really any rust and it doesn't really need replacing, we probably won't replace it, because we're going to be reasonably sympathetic. The current plan for the rear end of this car is to keep a de Dion setup in the back end. Originally we were thinking about probably changing the axle assemblies to something more modern, but actually the fundamentals are quite reasonable on these, and I think possibly by looking into the slightly later Aston parts bin, without being too specific yet because the plan's still up in the air, but I think looking to the slightly later Aston parts bin than more the 1990s Aston parts bin, we can probably modernise the existing setup to the point where I think it's satisfactory for what we're going to do with the car. And I quite like the Dion suspension. It's actually not an unpleasant means of putting wheels on the road on a car. There's a lot in its favour. Yes, independent's probably better overall, but actually there's a lot to be said for a de Dion setup. I think we're probably going to keep the de Dion setup in the back of this. But anyway, that's all for future things. Where we're at now is getting the car stripped down, which Matt's cracking on with. The next step after that will be stripping all the paint off, get back to the aluminium, get the aluminium panels removed from the body, from the chassis, get the chassis blasted all back to bare metal, can see what we're working with, get right back to the nuts and bolts, get right back to the bare bones. There's no point touching anything like this unless it is right back to the original bits of metal, and then building up from there. So that's where we'll be at fairly soon on this, and we'll be able to see the journey forward. Talking of right back to the metal, I'm going to hand over to Mark on the Interceptor, where we have just been right back to the metal, but I'll let him talk about that. Over to Mark.
All right, welcome back to another week. So this week we gave the Cosy a rest because we've been busy with other stuff, also getting this to this state now. So yesterday I sandblasted this. It took a while, it's a big car, loads of like detail bits, really hard to get in all the crannies, no wonder they rusted out. But yeah, so I spent, I think it was about 3.5 hours in the blast booth. Then handed over to Nat, he did the hot zinc spray. James got nice footage of both, I think. So yeah, then me and Steve jumped on it then, we had to hoover it out, keep turning it over, blowing it out, trying to get as much sand as we can out. Still a little bit in there, but it will eventually come out through body prep. It's like, then got it back in here, got it back on the spit. This is why the plyboard's on the floor, because this car is heavy. The trolley was trying to go through the plyboard. We didn't want the little wheels to go through into the grids, but we have made another trolley over there. Jamie will probably show you that later. But we're going to get it out now off the little trolley, because we've got to take the spit ends off and then get it up in the air to get the new trolley under. It's going to be hard, ball ache. But yeah, so I've got it all epoxied anyway while I was in here. So it's epoxied, all the bits Nat couldn't get with the hot zinc spray. I've done inside the car, I've done the boot area, done around the window shuts. He did hot zinc spray these bits anyway, but I just want to make sure there's no metal. But we've got to sort the outer panels out now, because while it was in metal work, Matt put some WD-40 on it. Tried to get it off as best we can, but we didn't want to, because it was a big rush yesterday to get it into epoxy. We thought we're not going to risk it. So we're going to panel wipe it, green scotch, make sure the WD-40 is off. It probably is all off, but like I said, I didn't want to risk it. So yeah, so big task to get it onto the new trolley now. And then me and Steve will go on it, clean it up as best we can, bring it back in here, epoxy all over it, and then it'll be into body prep. And then if you follow me, we'll go into here. Oh, wait there, let me just turn the tunes off. Copyright. There we go. Don't want no copyright infringement. In here is like chaos. Got Cosworth stuff. Been prepping the Jensen's boot lid for epoxy. Making sure it's all bare metal. Got the doors ready for epoxy to start body prep. Jag bumpers are ready from some of the den work we've got in. This one's coming from Spain, so we've sorted the bumpers out. They're a bit of a mess, so they've got to be painted sapphire blue. Cozzy's sitting here ready. I'm on holiday next week, so Gazzy's got all this to contend with next week. Lucky guy. So yeah, that's it this week. We've just been soldering on with stuff. I'll see you next time.
So thank you for that, Mark, and a cracking job of explaining where we're at on the Interceptor. And I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to Cal and let him talk you through the assembly shop and what's been going on there, and maybe have a little trip down to the den and see what's occurring there too. See you in actually not a week's time, because next week, both Cal and I are on holiday. So next week is going to be a little surprise episode, but we will see you the week after.
Cars. Welcome to the world's greatest car showroom. Bloody hell, look at him down there. He's just lying down having a sleep. You can't get the stuff these days, can you? Right, thank you very much, Nathaniel. I'm going to start with Project Kuma, very much in the latter stages now. We've got some fancy anodised bits going on, so the accent colour on this car is like a gunmetal grey versus its sister car, Project One, which had a bronze accent colour. So the cam cover, which is now on, which also hides all the coil pack wiring. I think Gibbo was just fitting the rear damper reservoir mounts, which are in the boot, which are another accent colour part on the car. Boot panelling on the back of the fuel tanks in, boot carpets all in. Seat belts have just been fitted on this. Just the last bits of interior going in, really. Actually, the billet, in fact, I'm going to lean in and get it. Look at this, daring. The instrument binnacle. Long-term watchers will say you keep banging on about the same thing, I'm sure, but I have, for those who haven't heard me say this before, when we did the drive fit, or the driver fit, shall we say, on these two cars, although the cars are generally quite similar, the driving positions were very different. Project One driving position was quite close to the steering wheel, and the steering wheel much higher. This one sitting much further back, steering wheel lower, such that actually the steering column on this is under the dash, where it was through the dash on the other car, and consequently also the instrument binnacles are quite different, because to have the steering column lower and not obscure the instrument binnacle sits much lower in the dash in this car versus Project One. So consequently the shape of this, the profile of it, where it meets up with the dash pad at the top is all quite different. So that is that, which is going to now go away for anodising. That's just black anodised. Gibbo's just been putting the mounting provisions in the dash for it and getting ready to mount it for the final time, but it's always best to practice on the ones before they've got the final surface finishing coatings on. So there's that, and then I've just actually received back the handbrake gaiter surround and the gear gaiter surround from laser etching with Bruce Holder, so the gear patterns lasered into the gear surround, obviously, and the handbrake one's got Project Kuma etched into it, so they're ready to go in. And actually that's more or less the final pieces of the interior. I've just trial fitted the final 3D print of the column shroud, so we did a prototype one which was like bright orange and green. Just printed the final one in a different material. We use like a carbon reinforced nylon material, which is much more temperature stable for final parts like that. So I've just tried that, that's fine. That's going off to Dean to be leathered, and then coming back from him should be the cage corners. So yeah, we're really in the final stages on that. And then Allegro. Anthony's just having a sleep over there. I think what he's probably working on is the splash shields that we're going to be doing that sit behind the wheels, and also we've just got to fit some seals that sit between the front inner wing and the outer wing there to stop the sort of wheel spray coming forwards. He's also been working on the doors, just tying up the loose ends with the window regulators and with the central locking actuators. Also doing the holes for where the wiring is going to go through for the electric window switches. We've got all the routing nicely in place, and in fact actually you'll notice on the door on the inner there's a little QR code sticker, which is a nice little mention for Global Workshop, and one of the functions that we use is their smart coding system. So that smart code, when you scan it, takes you to one of the timeline updates for the car, and that update was put on there by Alex. So he's done a diagram of where all the clips are going to go for the wiring, a sort of illustration of the wiring routing for the electric window switch and electric window and central locking actuator wiring, and then he's uploaded that update and generated a QR code sticker that takes you to that update, so when Anthony or any of the other guys are coming to put the door together, they can just scan that to see how it's supposed to be. So Anthony's actually been putting those provisions in, the little TC105 anchors for the wiring, just opening up the hole where the wiring actually comes through to the window switches for a certain grommet size. And because when we get the final billet parts back, the armrests, they have the switches in them, wiring will already be in place, everything will be ready to go. So that's good. And then actually you'll notice the first probably hint we've shown of the interior on this one against the orange exterior, which it's a pretty in-your-face combination, but I think it looks absolutely awesome. That kind of dark blue, navy blue leather with the Porsche blue check, which does look incredible. Now that back seat base is in there because we were just checking the wire routing that goes to the fuel sender and fuel pump, and just making sure it wasn't going to get pinched by any part of the back seat. But that's all looking good. So just carrying on with the wiring planning is what Alex has generally been on with. And then James has been on with the first of the two B18 engine rebuilds. So actually I'll hand over to him to tell you a bit about what he's been doing there.
Hello everyone, James here in the engine room. We're back with the Honda V18 engine. You may have seen a couple of weeks ago I had stripped all this down and was going through all the engine internals, just verifying that everything was okay wear-wise, and we found that the bores are oversized. Typically you just get some oversized pistons. They're no longer available from Honda, which meant we had to go with forged pistons on this one. Due to this engine having a pressed in gudgeon pin, we had to machine a tool to press out the old gudgeon pin to then retrieve the original com rods. And then had to press in the new ones, which were frozen, just to shrink them as much as possible. And we heated up the com rod just to allow that to press in a little bit easier. So got that all sorted, checked all the clearances on big ends and mains, they were all fine. The crank had little to no wear on it really, which is really good for an engine of this age, and typically used in quite a hard manner. So got all the bottom ending, got the crank in, gapped all the rings prior to putting the pistons in. That involves just making sure that the piston end gap isn't either too big or too small. If it's too big, you get too much blow-by, excessive oil consumption, and generally lower power because you're losing compression. If the gap is too small, when things heat up and the ring gets larger and then closes that gap, it can actually get stuck essentially in the groove within the piston, and it can cause a lot of issues, and in some instances pull the piston apart essentially, and the grooves between the rings. So I checked all those, got all them within spec, got the pistons and rods in. That's all buttoned up now and torqued up, ready to go. Due to the forged pistons, there could be some slight differences dimensionally compared to the standard piston. So at the minute, I'm loosely putting the head together. Obviously being a VTEC engine, I had to assemble all of the rockers and the rocker assemblies. And if you've never looked at a VTEC engine in bits or in any great detail, you probably already know inherently how they work. But if you look at them in detail on how it actuates across the rockers, it's a fascinating setup, and obviously made by some very intelligent guys back in the day. So I'd definitely urge you to have a look into that. But yeah, essentially, so I've built the head up with all of the bare components needed to get it timed. It's not complete yet as a cylinder head, but it will effectively allow me to put a time belt on, get it timed up and spin it round just to check nothing's hitting. Whilst I'm doing that, I've also got some blue tack essentially on top of the piston. That's to just verify what sort of clearance we've got from piston to valve. Theoretically, it should be fine. You
due to the differences, it's just best to have a visual representation of that as well, because you don't want to be cutting it too close, because as you go through high revs like this engine will, things can get a little bit closer, and there can be some harmonics which can cause like valve bounce to occur, which then can cause a contact, and we don't want that clearly. So that's where it's at the minute. I'll be checking that, taking the head back off, finishing that all back up, putting the back time cover on and all the front ones on after that. Any remaining parts like the oil pump, the flywheel, clutch, sump, cam cover, and at that sort of stage we should be about there on this one, and I'll start stripping down the second one. So cheers guys, see you soon.
Thank you very much, James. And I think I'm going to move around actually towards the Camaro. So a few little angles of attack on this. I've actually been doing a little bit of work on this myself. So I just wanted to get the wiper motor loom made up. So we this is a long while ago now. When we did the metalwork on this, we used a aftermarket wiper kit that basically relocated the motor to be in the scuttle cavity rather than on the bulkhead in the engine bay. And that came with a switch in the kit, and it's basically it gives you infinitely variable intermittence. So there's like you can change the intermittent speed and then 2 additional speeds after that, which I think originally this was probably only single speed or at the most 2 speed, but certainly didn't have intermittent, let alone variable intermittent. But the switch, which I can see down here actually, has a pre-wired kind of tail on it. So where we would normally kind of incorporate the connector into the main chassis loom, because it's got this tail on it, it didn't really make sense to do that. So when Max did the loom for this car, we just got him to do a DT connector with just the screen wash output, the live and the ground on it. So I just made up this little sub loom which goes between the motor in the scuttle area and the switch. So that can be installed now, just needs wrapping up and installing. And then we have, very excitingly, received the main centre console billet section that has the 2 instruments in it, the gear gator. So I've just trialled that up in the 3D printed console, and that is looking absolutely superb. So Richard has now taken that, so he can get on with wrapping that in. I don't know if it's going to be leather or Alcantara, but he's going to be wrapping that piece now. Now we've got the billet piece, so we can confirm the fit, and he can do any tweaks and changes to make sure it still fits after it's been wrapped. So that's all looking good. Other things on this really is we're getting so near to kind of getting everything together on it. I've been doing the final clear out of the parts shelf, which is always a sort of big landmark moment in a build, although it sounds a weird one. So we got to the point where the shelving unit upstairs with the components for this car on didn't really have many parts left that were going to still go on the car. So it was doing a final sort out, getting rid of any of the things that weren't being used, and we've now consolidated it down to just a small number of limb bins that now fit in the boot. So it's it's very nice when you get to that stage that the remaining components that are going to be fitted fit into the boot of the car, and it means it's freed up a shelf upstairs for the Aston DBS parts. I think Nat will have already mentioned that that's being stripped down at the moment. And actually that brings me on nicely to what Luke has been on with for the earlier part of this week, which is doing some visualization work on the interior. So he did a scan of the interior earlier this week, so we could just start getting in place the basic building blocks of how the interior is going to look. We're not kind of modeling physical parts at this stage, but we want to understand the layout, where switches are going to go, roughly what they're going to look like, where a nav screen is going to go, and just get a general overview so I can kind of show that to the customer and go, are we in the right lines with this or not? So he's been on with that, and it's looking pretty good actually as an initial stab. And I have to say the exterior was very similar, although we weren't changing a lot. It very quickly went in the direction of looking about right, which they tend to go 2 ways. You'll have seen with the Saab exterior modelling, the front end came together really quickly, and then the rear just was a massive struggle. We had similar with the Scimitar exterior design, where some bits of it fell into place really well, and some bits just took ages and ages to sort of slowly develop to being right. Whereas actually with the DBS, I think the interior, we're all on the same page pretty much straight away, and the exterior as well. So that's looking really good. And then George has been on with Project Geneva. My brain is fried today, I'm struggling to think of lots of things, but Project Geneva E-Type. While we just wait for Andy to finish the rear end metalwork, and then there'll be metal guys will be bashing on with that. Another angle of attack on that is the bonnet inner structure, and what ties in with that is the engine intake air boxes. Now that sounds like a strange thing to say, but what we want to do is have a forced filtered cold air feed to the engine, because a lot of the throttle body converted V12s we see, they just have gauzes on the trumpets under the engine bay, which isn't really acceptable. You'll just get ridiculously high engine intake temperatures. Now the original had kind of an intake filter box with a snorkel that sort of ended just above the radiator, which wasn't really ideal either. And strangely, they had the primary cold air that came around each side of the radiator. It was actually a ventilation feed to the footwells. But with this car being mainly driven with the top down, and it's going to have really good air conditioning as well, we don't really need that forced cold air feed to the cabin. So we're going to use the same area each side of the radiator to do a cold air feed to the engine, but we want to have some decent filtration in there as well. So what the rough plan is that we're going to design a really nice looking plenum on each of the banks of throttle bodies, one each side. Then that will lead to a aperture with a seal on it, and the other half of that aperture will be on the inside of the bonnet, and that will lead to a filter box that's mounted in front of the wheel behind the headlight, one each side on the bonnet. So we've got a cold air feed going to a filter box, replaceable panel filters, and then the rest of that outlet will then, when the bonnet's closed, mate up with the plenums that feed the engine. And then on the inside of the bonnet also the sort of inner structure of it, the splash shields, where the hinging is going to mount, because what I've probably neglected to mention here is we're doing a carbon fibre bonnet for that, and we've already done the moulds for it, for the outer, but we need to do the inner structure, which will be more carbon fibre pieces. So we're going to have an A surface inner, so you can see the carbon weave on it. That will include the splash shields, the mountings and filter boxes for the filters I've just talked about, and the mountings for the hinges and the mountings for the headlights, which will also be bespoke. So George is now cracking on furiously with modelling all of that, having now done a 3D scan of the engine with it all in its final position. So that will be interesting to see develop. Another thing I nearly forgot to mention, which I think was, actually it was squiz round here. You've probably been watching that whole scene with the lights dazzling behind, which I always say, Jamie, make sure you don't face the lights, and then I intentionally walk into a place that forces him to do exactly that. So on these, the aircon compressor, we're looking at obviously the engine ancillaries, as well as doing the core engine rebuild. Both of these have got air conditioning, and they're both running belt-driven compressors. The actual compressor you would have had on a Honda B18 in an Integra Type R. So George has been on with the rebuild of the first of those two compressors. However, we stripped that one down, ready to rebuild it, and actually it had been seized, had water inside it, and one of the bores in one of the little cylinders in there was quite badly pitted and corroded. So I think that one's going to be scrap. Thankfully, those compressors aren't that hard to come by, so we'll get another replacement used one and rebuild that, and then we've got a second one for the second car. However, whilst he had his head into aircon compressors, we've also pulled apart the aircon compressor for Project Churchill. And we're in the process of rebuilding that. I mean, generally they're actually reasonably straightforward to rebuild. You can get a service kit which has all the necessary seals and gaskets in it. So it's really just a case of pulling it apart, inspecting, making sure there's no wear on anything, replacing all the gaskets. But whilst it's apart, it allows us to bead blast the outer casing and plate all the fasteners and basically make it look brand new again. In the case of ones that you can't get new. Now obviously we can get brand new Sandon compressors, generic compressors, but when there is one that already has a perfect housing and a pre-made bracket to mount it to the Honda engine, it actually is more sensible and cost effective for us to just disassemble and rebuild the original compressor and put it back on again. So that's that. I'm frantically trying to remember if I have forgotten anything, which I don't think I have. So I'm going to hand over right now to Richard to cover what he's been doing down in the den.
How's it, everybody? Welcome back. Yeah, where did we leave off? It's still Ford Capri, the Consul. Everything went to plan so far, so fingers crossed we keep this trend going. Last week I told you about probably be finishing, maybe you'll see some seat covers, and I got some good news. You will see some fitted seat covers, and because I decided, let me concentrate a little bit on the front. So there we go, 2 front seats. very chuffed with them. The customer came around yesterday, so me and Carl had a meeting with him, and I am delighted to say that he's over the moon with it, which makes us more even over the moon, because that's why we do this. The customer satisfaction at the end is a big thing for us. So very nice with that. He actually sat in the seat, lovely, and then he brought us some extra bits because we're sort of going into the next stage now. The front seats was a big one. You can see we've got a console here. I cannot remember from which car this is. I will ask him again. Maybe Cal remembers, or I'll ask him as well. But this was like the go-to center console that guys, if they could get out one of them, they put this in the Ford Capri console, which is pretty cool because it's there or thereabouts. Apparently, it basically just bolts on. Retro power, we're gonna just make it cooler. So we're gonna design some nice billet bits. Cal and the guys in the cat cave with a bit of a wireless charger there. We'll put a leather gear gaiter, get rid of all this nasty aluminium, although it looks cool. That's not the same design as the actual console. That's got more like this wavy type of design. This is dash panels that he brought, so that's like a little fascia panel that sits in front of you in the car that matches with this nice radio. He's going to retain that. We might just change that to new. They'll do a conversion on this, so it will be all Bluetooth that goes to a speaker that's discreetly hidden. So that's going to look cool. So change the dashboard, the center console a little bit, get rid of some of these metal trims, trim it inside and out, same color as that, put some nice stitching details, maybe a little bit more padding there if you want to put your elbow in there. So yeah, that's the next step. So there's a lot of stuff that's not really me. So Cal and the guys will work on these type of things and see what they can come up with, and how we're going to remanufacture them to keep it looking like that, but just nicer. We've got to do something with this, whether it's painting or hydro dipping or whatever. We haven't really made up our minds up. Carl's going to come up with a couple of ideas. We present it to the customer, and he then makes his pick, and then we get it done for him. And we are very excited because we've all got this vision now of what this car is going to look like. So really excited. So this is a little original speaker panel that goes onto the dash topper. Things like this, we're going to decide, do we paint it? Originally, that and the little air vents was black contrast. We painted this. There's quite a bit bad pitting in there. I've trimmed one with leather. As you can see, Jamie will get a close-up shot, which looks absolutely amazing. But once we got to this, we go, oh, okay, we can't trim that because that still needs to be a grill. You can't trim, doesn't matter how thin I make the leather, I can't simply remove this grill and fold the leather over, because even if we get that leather to 0.6 millimeters, which is still a relatively strong enough thickness where I can stretch the leather and it won't just tear. By the time we bond that grill back, you're going to have that ridge and you're going to lose this nice cleanliness. So we decided on it's going to be painted or hydro dipped, something to that effect, stripped, and then we'll put some mesh in, maybe some acoustic cloth just to hide it, put the speaker back in there, and then hopefully that can Bluetooth to that. We're going to introduce some Alcantara in some areas. So inside the center console compartment there, it's usually nice to have some soft bits. This car doesn't have a glove box and dashboard, it's just got a little parcel shelf, a tray. So we've decided we're going to put some Alcantara on there. It's just nice to have something soft to put your phone on or whatever. Maybe you've got an expensive pen that you don't want to be rolling around on something hard. So that's going to look cool, a little bit of different textures. That's that. Very happy with it. I hope you guys like it as much as we do and the customer. Back seats are up next. So last week you saw me, I've had all of this foamed up. I've done the patterning. One thing I realized, because this, I'll just grab this piece and just try and demonstrate this. I've got the strips. Because that folds in there, I don't want to just do all the patterning and then all the cutting, then all the sewing, and then, because what's going to happen is I can't judge how much this leather, every material, vinyl, whatever you use, has got different stretches in it and stuff. So depending on how hard I pull this down, there's a gap that could potentially grow or bulge out, if you want to call it that. So what I'm going to do in this to get it perfect, because we can't just make cover after cover until we get it right. We want to try and get it right first time, and a way to do that is just do it in sections. Do this first, pull this, get it all fitted 100%. That will give me that, and then I put this bare foam pad on there with the frame obviously and everything as it would be in the car. And then I'll see, do I need to add a bit of foam? This is actually oversized still, so it probably needs to be cut off same distance as that. But if that pulls down, I'll have to bring that down. So whether that's just a straight 90 cut, or do I use my brand new bandsaw and cut it at a bit of an angle to get it even more perfect, we'll get there. But that's going to allow me to then get that to sit nice, and there'll be absolutely no gap and complete straight flush lines. So when you reach back to pick up that laptop bag, you see a perfect back seat. Anyway, so that's where we are, where we're now, Thursday, so it's patterning, cutting. So next time I speak to you, you will probably see the rear seat. I can't wait to show you. I'll see you next week.
We're going to thank your mate.
I didn't thank my mate. Terry Holton from South Africa. I read all the comments, not all the comments, but I do pick up on some comments, and it is lovely to hear from you. And yes, I'm still using the Serafil, only the best, you know. We will probably get to some embroideries. For now, the customers all just want it plain. We're doing some embossing here and there, but when we get there, I'm pretty sure I'll give you a shout, and I'll make sure I use the best embroidery thread out there. See you soon, mate.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. And I would normally end on saying see you next week, but as Nat alluded to, we're going to have a slightly different episode next week. So I look forward to showing you that episode, and we will see you the week after.